Today, we're going to talk about coping with COVID-19 anxiety. People everywhere are very, very anxious about what is happening with this pandemic, what to do for themselves, for their families, and what's going to happen in the future. Hello, my name is Mary Thompson. I'm a psychotherapist based in Toronto, Canada. I've worked over 30 years in mental health, and I've spoken with many, many anxious people to help them cope. I've also led workshops and seminars in mental health because I really enjoy talking to people about it and reducing the stigma. I'm an expert in the use of CBT, which is short for cognitive behavior therapy. It's a well-regarded kind of psychotherapy that is used for depression, anxiety, and many other emotional and mental health issues. Today, in the context of COVID-19, I want to talk about what anxiety is, how it affects us, and what we can do to cope more effectively with it. The topics we'll cover are mental health issues associated with COVID-19 anxiety, the CBT model, understanding what anxiety is and how it affects us, how we can actually make ourselves worse, how to cope with anxiety more effectively using cognitive behavior therapy. The key things we really want to focus on is compassion for ourselves and for others, as well as focusing what is actually in our control, which involves changing how we think and changing what we do. And then we're going to wrap up with a list of practical things to try for coping with COVID-19 anxiety. We're going to start with talking about the mental health issues that are associated with COVID-19 and what to do when you feel overwhelmed. We're all hearing scary news every day, all the time about this pandemic. Lots of people are really anxious, and we hear people doing crazy things like panic buying and hoarding and sanitizing everything. People ask me, isn't being worried about a pandemic normal? Isn't it a reaction to scary news? But how much anxiety is too much? So indeed, there is lots to worry about. Every minute of every day for the last couple of months, we've been hearing about the harsh reality of COVID-19. There's quarantines, social bans, social distancing, and the closing of most services. People are worried about the future, their jobs, their financial security, their own health, their elderly parents' health and mortality, and their kids' education being interrupted. They're worried about being able to get what they need just day by day, things like toilet paper and cleaning supplies and food. I've heard from my friends and my clients who are really anxious and they don't know what to do. They're unsure whether to go out and stock up or whether to stay inside and have no contact with anyone. And people who have pre-existing anxiety disorders, this amount of negative information is really the perfect storm of things to worry excessively about. When people experience panicky feelings and they find themselves behaving differently than normal, they start to become concerned about whether they have a mental health disorder. So when is anxiety more than just worry? Well, as I said, there are many reasons to worry. There's facts and evidence that this pandemic is unprecedented. What is also difficult is more recently the amount of information and misinformation that we're getting and how fast we get it. Anxiety is a normal response to uncertainty. That's basically what it is. And we don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19. We can't make any plans. Nobody can predict how long these restrictions are going to go on, or how many people will get sick and die, or what the long-term economic impact is. Let me say, though, that there are advantages to worrying. Sounds a little weird, but basically, worry helps us to anticipate bad things that happen. The what-ifing, what if this, what if this, in order to help us be more prepared to do what we need to do to survive. So identifying these issues by doing this what-ifing, then it allows us to problem solve. And we can create an action plan to reduce risk or improve outcomes. But how much worry is too much? If people are too worried about it, Has it become a mental health issue? A mental health disorder is basically when there's ongoing signs and distress a lot of the time and quite severely, to the point that some of your roles within your life are interfered with. Roles as an employee, as a spouse, as a parent, as a member of society or a social person. If more than one of those roles are hard for you to carry out, then we're looking at your life being disrupted to a significant point. Reacting to stressful situations like a pandemic with distress and anxiety is absolutely natural and reasonable. A word on anxiety disorders then. I'm going to talk about the couple of main ones that we're discussing when we talk about mental health disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is excessive worry about a number of everyday things, but it has an exaggeration of the actual risk, and it is worry most of the hours of the day and for at least 6 months. Panic disorder, when people talk about having panic attacks, a panic attack is a sudden feeling of fear, sudden intense fear that lasts for a short period of time. And it involves things like a racing heart, shakiness, sweating, tense muscles, upset stomach, those kind of things. Now, panic attacks are a normal reaction to a stressful situation, or they can also be part of another anxiety disorder. How about OCD? People are wondering how much hand washing is too much, how much sanitizing. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, has both obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions are unwanted or intrusive, troubling thoughts or images that cause anxiety, and people feel they cannot control them. Compulsions are the repetitious rituals that you hear about, like excessive hand washing, checking that the door is locked, that the stove is off. But it's excessive. It could be 12, 15, 20 times of checking, or washing your hands for a very long period of time. People do the compulsions in order to reduce the anxiety that comes with the obsessive thoughts. So with lots to worry about and constant information about bad things to look for, can people actually make themselves sick with worry? This is where we ask the question, isn't it all in your head? Well, worries do start in our head, with our perceptions and thoughts. However, there are ways that we can make things quite a bit worse, particularly by dwelling on the worst case scenario. CBT explains how anxiety affects us emotionally, physically, and behaviorally. There's a five-element model in CBT. So basically, step 1, bad stuff happens. This is the situation or the triggering event. Now, when we talk about the mind-body connection, we hear a lot about that the last while. So we know that how we think will affect what happens to us physically. We talk about stress-related symptoms and illness, things like ulcers and IBS. Our thoughts also, however, affect our emotions. So our interpretation of situations is really going to affect how we feel. So if I tell myself something bad is going to happen, I will feel anxious. If I tell myself that somebody's treating me unfairly, I'm likely to feel angry. It follows then that how we look at things will also affect what we do, our behavior. If I'm scared, I will run. If I'm angry, I will lash out or do a cold silence. What we think affects how we feel both emotionally and physically, and what we do. That's really the key thesis of CBT. When we talk about the fear reaction, we talk about the fight-flight reaction. Fear triggers that fight-flight or freeze reaction, which is a response to threat. It's a way to protect ourselves from danger, and it's a key to our survival. What actually happens in the fight or flight response? Two systems exist within us. There is the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. I roll my eyes because I usually forget which is which myself, and I have to look at it. So when we are relaxed, our bodies have engaged the parasympathetic nervous system, also known as the rest and digest system, which is concerned with our long-term survival. However, when our body feels threatened, it kicks in with the sympathetic nervous system. This is the fight or flight response for immediate short-term survival. The sympathetic nervous system is primitive, and it enables our bodies to do what they need to do in order to move away quickly, flee, or to fight. It pumps adrenaline into the system, which makes our hearts beat faster. We sweat, we tense our muscles, we have trouble breathing, our stomach gets upset, we have urgency to go to the bathroom, those kind of things. This is exactly what a panic attack feels like in your body. In a good article recently in the Toronto Star on March 20th, 2020, the writer Steve McKinley makes a reference to a conversation he had with Steve Jurdans, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, Scarborough campus, noting that when the threat is dealt with, our bodies can go back to its rest and digest mode. But in the case of the pandemic, the threat is continual, with no obvious thing to be done about it and little chance to escape exposure. So there's nothing to fight and nowhere to flee. He says further, so many of us feel like our bodies are a bit energized a lot of the time, and we're compelled to do something, but we really don't know what that thing is. I've told friends recently, as this has been going on, I feel unsettled a lot of the time, kind of restless, hard to get stuff done, hard to concentrate. They've told me they are experiencing the same thing as well. The problem with being in a constant state of fight or flight then, having that red light danger switch on all the time, constantly over a long period of time, is it causes cortisol to be released by the adrenal glands, which temporarily suppresses our immune system. So over time, we have a compromised immune system, which can make us even more vulnerable to illness. This is why we need to find ways to cope differently for our own health, physical and mental. So what's the freeze part of the fight, flight, freeze reaction? Some animals survive by using camouflage. They blend in with their environment, like a lizard in the desert, the color of sand, or herons standing in the reeds. They stop moving in order for predators to not see them. Same for us. When we don't know what to do, sometimes we freeze. We're paralyzed. And it's really hard to fight or to run from a microscopic invisible virus. So we just stop and shut down. Now, with the pandemic, we're being told to isolate. When people are anxious under normal circumstances, they tend to isolate. This is a symptom of an anxiety disorder. They hide in bed. They avoid seeing people. They don't go out. Being isolated is a great opportunity to get stuff done. We've certainly heard that in the media as well. Things you've been putting off, here's your chance. You don't have to go to work. And some folks are certainly doing this. But anxious responses in this crisis situation mean that some folks are isolating beyond what's advised. They've stopped communicating with friends and family. They are no longer cleaning or doing tasks around the house or even bathing. I find myself that I have this sense of lethargy and lack of motivation, as I mentioned, without deadlines or normal schedule. And that was happening already as I left full-time work at the beginning of this year. So I'd already had a sense of being a little bit at sea, but the forced social isolation has increased that. Without deadlines, it can cause us to think, it doesn't really matter what I do. Why do I have to get out of my pajamas? Nobody's coming over. Or why do I have to even clean up? Nobody will see me. Nobody will see my place. And some people don't even enjoy their own company. They don't feel good being alone. Some people cope by keeping too busy so that they don't have to feel the loneliness or the anxiety. Forced isolation can also highlight the lack of supports that some people have if they don't have many friends or social supports or work supports. This is where we can run into the overlap between anxiety and depression. When people start to feel lethargic, fatigued, powerless, and ultimately hopeless. The fight-flight response is built into us for survival, but it is not meant to be a sustained state. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that we can make things worse. How do we do this? I'm going to talk about safety behavior and the vicious cycle. When we are afraid, we do whatever we can in order to cope and survive. From CBT, we understand that in anxiety, the fight, flight, freeze sensations are accompanied by the feelings of fear. The fearful feelings and panicky physical responses are generally followed by the behavior of running, lashing out, fighting, or hiding. The things we use to cope with distress are known as safety behaviors. However, sometimes what we do to cope, such as avoiding or getting angry with people, losing our temper, or drinking too much, can cause us to feel shame and guilt, which then again can lead to depression and hopelessness because of how we are beating ourselves up, and then we'll run away more or behave in more difficult ways. On and on it goes. So a vicious cycle is created. Therapist and author Margaret Werenberg said, "An anxious mind challenges you to cope over and over with the very things you fear and is circular in nature." What we do ultimately ends up maintaining and worsening our mood, making ourselves sick by how we interpret events that are going on, and then doing things that make ourselves feel worse. This is the vicious cycle that CBT talks about. Let me speak about dysfunctional safety behavior and worsening mood, how this connects. Because the ways that some people cope with their anxiety regularly, and particularly in this time of crisis, can be difficult and self-defeating. Here's some examples. We've already mentioned panic buying and stockpiling. This is because of the fear that we're going to run out, not be able to get what we need. This can reduce resources for others, which can then lead to guilt. If we've bought up all the stuff that's important, as we're hearing on the news, like masks or gloves, then they're not available for healthcare workers, and people can feel badly. Another difficult behavior is avoiding and procrastinating, which again, noted a lot of people are doing during this time. So not showering, not cleaning, not doing our taxes. I have a number of friends who said the papers are sitting on the table and somehow I'm not getting to them. The tension that comes from these behaviors we do to cope that can be problematic is heightened when we're confined at home with other people, with little or no privacy. So that can create more conflict and tension interpersonally. And unfortunately, the risk of family violence does increase under these circumstances of quarantine. The obvious thing that people think about as a dysfunctional coping technique is drinking too much or abusing other substances. It does give a temporary respite from how we feel, but definitely has long-term consequences. And overeating or comfort eating, binge eating, is another way that people try to feel better. In moderation, that's okay. But if there's too much of it, we're likely to gain weight, feel more lethargic, and worse about ourselves. So it has an emotional consequence. So we can see that COVID-19 is contributing to a whole range of mental health and behavioral issues. How can we cope with COVID-19 anxiety more effectively? How can we help ourselves? And how can we help and reassure other people who are really worried? First of all, telling people not to worry isn't helpful. My clients have told me this many times over the years. Start with self-compassion and compassion for others. Give yourself and others a break. These are unusual times. Beating yourself up only makes that vicious cycle worse. We and others act instinctively out of fear. And people tend to revert to old behavior and bad habits when they're in a crisis. We need to interrupt this cycle. And we can only interrupt it if we're aware of it. We need to tune in and figure out what's happening in these connections between our thinking and feeling, so that we can then make a change. We also need to practice acceptance. The threats of illness and confinement are very real. There's lots of evidence that this is a global crisis with few clear roadmaps as to what's going to happen next. So first we need to validate our concerns and the concerns of others with compassion and realism. Bill Howitt in the Globe and Mail on March 25, 2020 said, "It's important not to place blame, as there's no blame to place. This is a global health crisis that has no set of instructions. It's totally normal to feel isolated, worried, and not sure what to do." When I start to talk about acceptance, people ask me, are you saying to just agree with things or just say it's okay? There's some pretty bizarre paranoid ideas out there. For example, that COVID-19 is a Russian conspiracy or a Democrat hoax, or that you need to have 6 months of toilet paper in order to get through this. Acceptance as a coping strategy does not simply mean agreeing with somebody else or saying things are fine or okay. Acceptance comes from a lot of different therapeutic models. It originated in Buddhism. It's been used in CBT and also more recently in DBT, which stands for dialectical behavior therapy. When we talk about acceptance in therapeutic terms, we talk about the need to accept that things are uncertain. And with COVID-19, things are changing hour to hour. Life as we know it has been interrupted significantly. Acceptance is really about finding the middle ground between denial on the one end and negative exaggeration on the other. So if you picture a continuum where denial is everything's fine, everything's perfect, and the other end is this is a catastrophe, we're all going to die, we want to find a way to move away from the negative, slightly towards the positive, and say, it is what it is for now. We can only do what we can do. It's about realistically admitting what is in our control and what is not in our control. So then the question arises, what actually is in our control in this disaster? How can people worry less and manage their anxiety better? Earlier I said that CBT does agree that upsetting stuff happens and that we need to find ways to cope with it. Within this model, the only things that are really in our control are our thoughts and our behavior. To start to cope more effectively, we need to slow down and focus on what is actually in our control. A fun way I've heard it recently is not my circus, not my monkeys. This is a way to remind ourselves to pay attention to what is in our control and to recognize that there are things we are not accountable or responsible for. What other people choose to do is not within our control, as well as global events. As I earlier referenced Bill Howlett's Globe and Mail article, he says, the alternative is for your emotional brain to take over, creating negative emotions and thoughts, as well as reacting in ways that can put yourself and others at risk. This is again March 25th, 2020. Focusing your brain and time and attention on what is in your control sends a different signal to your brain. It takes your body then off the high alert, turns off that red danger light, and allows you to relax. This is that rest and digest reaction I mentioned, the way that we react when things are stable and predictable. We can interrupt the anxious cycle of fear, helplessness, and avoidance by changing what we think and or changing what we do in order to cope more effectively and feel better. I'd now like to share with you tips for changing your thinking. Change your focus and perspective. It is possible. First of all, stop dwelling on the worst case scenarios. In CBT, we call it stop catastrophizing. When we pay too much attention only to the bad things that can go wrong, we remain in this constant state of arousal, the fight-flight, as I mentioned earlier. That red light stays on in our brain and affects our body. And we're not built to maintain that constant state. This, as I said, will make us vulnerable to illness, and it compromises our immune system. Secondly, separate facts from interpretations. So we need to separate the more emotional interpretations, which is how we feel about things, from the actual facts, the pragmatic evidence, things that most people would agree on. In order to put things in perspective, we need to differentiate reality from what our fears are. It's also important to move away from emotional reasoning and remind ourselves that there are ways we can protect ourselves, like hand washing and social distancing, even in the face of this challenging news and uncertainty. We need to move away from our heart, which is our emotional reasoning, back into our head, where we have facts and evidence. Trying to find the balance between, on the one end, we do need to keep ourselves informed and be cautious, but on the other end, freaking out and obsessing. How do we find that middle ground? That's really important for managing anxiety. Another thing we can do with our thoughts is consciously choose to focus on the positives. Instead of dwelling on what we cannot do, look at what you can do, or what you have done before that has worked. Try to find something even a little bit better. As we said, move a bit towards the positive without being in denial. So instead of saying, I'm going to die, try saying, I'm going to get pretty sick for a couple of weeks and it will be very uncomfortable. Instead of saying, I'm going to be trapped inside for months and I'll be helpless and I'll run out of food, say, I may have to quarantine for a couple of weeks and it will be frustrating and I'll probably survive it. So choosing to focus on the positive, change our perspective, it all counts towards helping you feel better and calming that reaction between your brain and your body. Another really helpful way to manage anxiety, particularly the obsessing and ruminating, where you go over and over the negative thoughts, is thought stopping and replacement. Originally, I learned that you picture a big red stop sign or yourself shouting stop, and then you shift over into something distracting. Another image, which shows my age, is you can picture if you had vinyl and a record, sometimes it would get stuck when you go ka-chuk, ka-chuk, ka-chuk. So I say, well, take the arm off, remove the needle, and then replace it with another record that has lovely relaxing music or something you enjoy. I recently attended a workshop with Margaret Warenberg, as I mentioned, who's a psychologist, a coach, and she's the author of the book, The 10 Best Ever Anxiety Management Techniques. She teaches that any thought that we think repeatedly, like I can't cope, creates a neurological rut within our brain. So repeated thinking creates a neurological rut within our brain, which are called neural pathways. You may have read a bit about neuroplasticity. This is this idea. Any thought or action that you repeat is then recognized by the brain as really important. So your brain says, I'm going to help you with this. So your brain starts supplying more your brain starts supplying those neural pathways with more blood and white cell support to speed up the processing. Again, because you've alerted it to the importance by repeatedly thinking that. So she uses the term that a worry pathway then becomes a worry superhighway with many on-ramps onto it. And when you have a worry superhighway to speed down, your best option is to interrupt it, stop it, and move away from the worry thought. Find an off-ramp. When you stop repeating the negative anxious thought, your brain will quickly stop supplying the extra blood vessels and white cells. The worry highway will revert back to a pathway because your brain decides the thoughts are no longer necessary. When you have anxious repetitive thoughts then, you need to stop and interrupt them by consistently and repeatedly telling yourself, "Self, stop it." So we've talked a bit about how to change your thinking. However, it's not enough just to stop thoughts. You need to replace them because they consistently will go back to the worst case scenario. Thought replacement can be done a few ways. One is to substitute a negative obsessive thought with a positive obsessive thought. A simple one that you've planned in advance. It should be positive and pleasant, because if you're going to establish a rut in your brain, it might as well be a positive rut. Something like a poem, an affirmation, a scripture passage, or song lyrics. Something that you have memorized so your brain can quickly access it. Then you can compete with the worry thought by actually saying or singing this out loud. This adds the dimension of speech. You're actually experiencing it within your body, and that will make your brain pay even more attention. This is certainly something that I have done, which is to sing out loud in my car. I actually have a playlist of my sing out loud songs where I know enough of the lyrics that my brain can just go there. I find this really helpful myself. Another way of replacing it is after you say stop, to immediately distract yourself to something that takes up your whole attention. It could be a TV show, talking to a friend, going for a walk, some kind of change of scenery, but something that you can put your attention on. Or another final way you can do it is simply to consciously refocus back on what you're doing before the negative thoughts intruded. I say simple, but not easy. That's important to really recognize with all these strategies. They're not instinctive and they're not easy to do. The concept is simple. Stop your thinking, think positive, this kind of stuff. But I'm really reassuring you in a compassionate way, it's not going to be easy to do. Along with changing your perspective and thought stopping, another way to change your thinking is to practice gratitude. Gratitude helps people to refocus on what they have instead of what they lack, to focus on the positive present, not the scary future. Gratitude helps people feel more positive emotions, relish good experience, improve their health, deal with their anxiety, and build stronger relationships. People are more likely to want to be around us if we're being grateful than being negative. Try exercises like keeping a gratitude journal, writing down things that you're grateful for. It could be at a particular time of day or as it comes up. Another way of expressing gratitude is to write thank you notes, expressing your enjoyment and appreciation of somebody else's impact on your life. My partner does this regularly, writes very thoughtful thank you notes and sends them in the mail to people where he's had an important encounter that's enhanced his life, and they express such appreciation for that and what a difference it's made. Recently, he got a photograph of somebody who'd posted one of his cards, and that's helping them cope with this crisis. Positive focus increases dopamine, which rewards the brain, helps it to feel better, so it will continue to do that rather than go down that worry superhighway. Changing our thinking is good and important. However, it's sometimes not enough or even possible. When people are panicking, when their body's kicking into fight or flight, your heart's pumping, and your brain isn't thinking clearly and is flooded with neurotransmitters, thinking is hard. What can we do? So now let's talk about changing what we do, interrupting self-defeating behavior. Activities are really important. Taking action is essential for dealing with anxiety and depression. When your heart is pumping, your gut is churning, and you can't even catch your breath, it's not going to be possible to practice positive self-talk. More likely, you're going to be telling yourself, I'm short of breath, I'm having trouble breathing, I've got a fever, I'm hot, I must have COVID-19, I'm going to die. Or on the other hand, another consequence, as we mentioned, your body, if you are immobilized by inertia and fatigue and lack of motivation, thinking is usually not enough to get you out of that slump. And it will be really hard to think of positive things. So you're more likely to also feel shame and guilt and go into that downward spiral, a result of not doing anything. It's very important to take action. Doing something that you actually have control over gives you more realistic and slightly more positive evidence that you can cope. This is better than the 100% belief that nothing you can do helps. It gives you evidence of your capacity and your ability, which gives you more motivation and reverses that downward self-defeating spiral. When we talk about actions, we're talking about behavior, behavioral goals, things we can do. First of all, we need to break them down into smaller pieces to make them manageable. Making goals more modest and realistic makes it easier to start, less likely to put off, and you can also quit earlier and still have a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. SMART goals are something that comes out of motivational theory. SMART is an acronym. S stands for specific, which is that goals should be straightforward, clear, and easy to remember, not too vague or general, emphasizing the specifics, where, what, how, when, of what we want to happen. This helps us to focus our efforts more specifically. M is for measurable. Choose a goal with measurable, concrete criteria so you can observe change and measure progress towards the attainment of your goal. A is for attainable. A goal should stretch you slightly, but it must remain possible, even given a bad day, a bad week, or a bad hour, so you don't get discouraged. If it feels too big, you're not even going to start. R is for realistic. It needs to be doable, not necessarily easy, as we mentioned, stretching you, but it's got to be realistic. Goals need to fit with your mental, physical, and situational limitations, vulnerabilities, and your abilities. T is for timely. Set a time frame for the goal. Tonight, a couple of days, week from now, 3 months. That is measurable and realistic. Putting an endpoint to the goal gives you a clear target to work towards, and it is also likely to reduce procrastination. Another strategy for helping to focus goals that will give you a bit more success is called the 5-minute rule. It comes out of the book Mind Over Mood and the teachings of Christine Pedetsky and Dennis Greenberger. This involves trying an activity for just 5 minutes and then being free to continue or to stop doing it. So again, this is an activity that you've already broken it down with a SMART goal, so it's very specific and small. So you just start doing something in the direction of it for 5 minutes, then you can stop with permission and get credit for it. Give yourself the check mark that you've accomplished the goal. Because any action, however small, is a change from paralysis, and it provides a boost in motivation and energy. Further talking about activities, there are aspects of activities that can make them more likely to be helpful. First is that they captivate your interest. This will help to distract your brain from the catastrophizing. Also, that you find them pleasant or entertaining to help you feel better. And this is also recognizing that people have very different tastes. The kind of music you like may not be the kind of music I like. Just a note, when we talk about distraction though, all good things in moderation. There is a difference between watching Netflix and binging on Netflix. Again, we talk about balance and middle ground is about how we get more mentally healthy. Activities are also more helpful if they give you a sense of accomplishment. As we mentioned, if you've been putting things off, break it down, choose one aspect of something you've been putting off, get a sense of accomplishment, and that's going to help your motivation, help you feel better, and again, reduce shame and guilt. Finally, activities that are in line with your values are going to help you feel better. If you're doing something that helps others, that's going to increase your sense of ability and capacity, as well as the idea that we're trying to do something, especially in the face of this pandemic and helplessness. Now we're going to talk about what are actual practical things you can do to cope with COVID-19 anxiety. Now we've talked about the principles of what kind of ways to think and do. What can we actually do? Number one, stay connected with others for your sake and theirs. This is email, phone, Zoom, texting, or old school, telephone I mentioned. So however you stay connected, whatever medium you use, find a way to do this. Talk to your neighbor over your balcony or your deck as long as you're 6 feet away. What's important is to engage with others you feel close to and who feel emotionally safe. If you're reacting emotionally and you're very distressed and anxious, it is really good to talk to people you trust, people that can help give you perspective, especially if you're doubting yourself or fearing the future. Use peer group support is another tip I advise my clients. If you're unsure who to talk to, look for safe telephone or online peer support or crisis support from local community mental health agencies. One support is Big White Wall. It's an online peer support where you can chat, and there's modules to help with coping strategies. Another resource is the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario, who have online or telephone peer support. There's many other resources out there. You can look them up. Another part of connecting is to reach out to people you're concerned about, people who might be elderly or ill or have a pre-existing anxiety disorder and are going to be more vulnerable at this time. People are more fearful when they have too much time left alone to think. We talked about, again, repetitive negative thoughts and lots of scary media info coming in all the time. They may feel cut off from the world. So connecting is going to help reduce their sense of isolation and helplessness. Another practical thing to do in terms of this connecting is find ways to donate money. Many charities now are in tough times and making requests, ways that we can donate financially that will help us feel better and help us feel we're doing something when we're sitting at home feeling powerless. Something I heard recently when we're talking about connecting is call your friends and talk to them about something that is good. Because the tendency is to obsess and worry about all the bad news. To consciously say, tell me something good that you've done today or that happened or that you read or saw, to focus on the positives, as we mentioned before. That will help with the anxiety. Will also help you both look for evidence that this is not the end of the world and find other ways to think. Connecting with others will calm your hyper-vigilant stress response and help you to feel more in control. Another very important tip, limit time on media. Reduce your access to bad news. If you've obsessively been watching a 24-hour news cycle on COVID-19, the news feeds are responding to every worry, you've been responding to every alert, you're never going to get a break from those anxious thoughts and physical responses. This pandemic is slow moving. I heard this recently somewhere. It's not like a brush fire. It's not like a hurricane. You don't need to check multiple times a day in order to be updated. I suggest try looking at COVID-19 or news updates once a day, at most twice, and consider limiting the amount of time you do that for 5 or 10 minutes. Put a maximum on it. Or set a specific time of day to watch news. And I especially recommend not at bedtime, not even with an hour of bedtime, when we're talking about how to help ourselves sleep more effectively. And certainly obsessive anxious thoughts will interrupt sleep. Having about an hour of downtime away from media and devices before bed. Turn off your alerts or use the mute feature to limit your exposure to certain keywords or users. Finally, if you have trouble resisting the urge to check obsessively, which many people do in these situations, put your phone in another room or give it to a family member to limit your exposure to bad news. Along with limiting exposure, it's really important to only read or listen to credible sources, such as information from government resources, officers of health. I say government, not politicians. Reputable, I always have trouble with that word. Reputable organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, or the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, have very good websites and updates. It's trustworthy information. Or the Mayo Clinic, which is good for medical information. Twitter, Facebook, Susie's blog, they're kind of sketchy sources of information. It may just ramp up anxiety. Another coping strategy: get as much sunlight, fresh air, and nature as you can if you're not in quarantine. Go where you will see trees and flowers and green things. It's been shown to calm down that hyperarousal system. Walk your dog. I've seen lots of people walking dogs. Go for a walk in your neighborhood or where you can see water. The key thing is make sure you maintain the social distance of 6 feet or 2 meters between people. Smile at others and make eye contact. When I've gone out for my walks, I noticed that people weren't making eye contact. I guess they're afraid that I'm going to try and engage them and get too close. Social distancing isn't emotional distancing. We can wave, we can smile, even if people are crossing on the sidewalk on the other side of the road to get away from us. It's a way of connecting. Listen, spring is here. The birds are singing. They're not affected by these restrictions. I find just hearing a bird song quite uplifting to my mood. Another tip, and we keep hearing this, try to keep active. So this is even if you are stuck inside. You can use a treadmill or a stationary bike. There's online yoga resources, exercise resources. Do YouTube exercises. Something I find really helpful is to put on dance music and have a dance break in my living room. That totally lifts my spirits, and it also moves my mind away from worries. If you have a balcony, a backyard that you can go out in, do that. If you're in an apartment building, walk the stairs, walk the hallways, again, as long as you're not getting too close to people. If you're sitting at the computer all day, get up and stretch about every hour. Get the blood flowing. You can even set alarms on your phone to remind you to get up and move. Experts emphasize over and over, another tip that's very important is set up a routine. This is particularly helpful for people who struggle with anxiety and depression. Try getting up the same time every day and going to bed at the same time every day. A regular wake-up time will help us set our circadian rhythm. That's our body's natural clock. And as well, try to get some morning light, because morning light also helps to set the clock. Stick to a regular schedule with your meals, your exercises, your activities as much as you can. And again, it will take a process to develop this. And it might be a different schedule from what you're used to. You're no longer working 9 to 5. Pay attention to your body's natural rhythms. You might find it's midnight till 6 or 2 a.m. till 10. Try some experimenting, find a schedule and routine that works for you, and try to maintain it as many days of the week as possible. Another thing that's important in setting up schedule and routine is pretend you're going to work. Make a difference, a differentiation between sleeping and being in your pajamas and then going to work or engaging in the world. If you have breakfast, which is a good thing to do, afterwards have a shower, put on different clothes. Don't stay in your pajamas all day. Make sort of a boundary between starting your day. That can be psychologically helpful. If you're always doing the same thing in the same place, wearing the same thing day and night, that can contribute to depression and lethargy. Again, sometimes it's easy to say, hard to do. I appreciate that. Another tip we're hearing a lot is make space in your head and body. Do some breathing exercises. Do some yoga, tai chi, meditation. Use positive visualization to counter the scary images that are going in your head. As we mentioned, what you put in your head can really make a difference to how you feel. Picture a place where you feel safe. It could be a place you've been, like a cottage or a vacation. It could be a fantasy place, which is everything you've ever dreamed of. A beach, whatever would help you feel peaceful and at rest. Meditating, we know, is important. It helps calm the brain and the body. Do spiritual practices, whatever that means to you. Prayer, reflection, reading things that are inspirational. Try all kinds of things that might calm you down. We spoke about the importance of nature. Look at nature images or videos online. Look out your window. That can give you some space. When we talk about breathing, there's something called box breathing. I'll just say what it is briefly. If we think of a box, it has 4 sides. So box breathing basically means the breathing in slowly through our nose and then out through our mouth to the count of 4, counting 4 in, counting 4 out, and then doing it 4 times like a box. And then doing that 4 times a day. This is part of mindfulness. If we practice stopping and consciously breathing, with practice over time, the relaxation response will start to kick in sooner. Listen to music that's relaxing. I've already mentioned that that's really important. It gives us space. It gives us a different place to be, as does reading, if we can pay attention. When we're anxious and distracted, it may be hard to pay attention. So having a list of things you can do means you can try one. If it doesn't work, go on to something else. This will also reduce your sense of helplessness if you have a number of strategies. Here's something that's great. Be creative. That can be whatever you decide that is. It could be painting, photography, writing poetry, writing songs, playing an instrument, composing music, doing a blog, doing crafts, knitting, doing puzzles, anything that engages different parts of your brain than the worrying. It helps you to be present. It's something that's in your control. I find when I make crafts and I do jewelry, the doing it is distracting because I'm focused on the color and the shapes. Also at the end of it, I have a sense of accomplishment because I've made something. So again, doing something creative engages us in different ways and has different ways to help us feel better. Finally, use humor. This crisis has brought about a lot of humorous videos, anecdotes, memes. I'm getting them every day. Sharing them with people becomes another way we can connect on a positive note. So utilize your sense of humor. Find things that make you laugh. It also helps your body and brain relax. There's a list of a bunch of strategies you can try. I've given you a lot of information, lots to think about. So we're going to wrap up now, and I'll just highlight a couple things. We've looked at anxiety as a normal response to threat. And with COVID-19, there are many threats to our mental, emotional, physical, and interpersonal life. Hopefully now we understand a little bit more about what anxiety is, how it connects between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior when there's a stressful situation. And even though there's lots to worry about, there's things we can do to interrupt that vicious cycle that causes us to feel paralyzed and stuck. We want to be able to feel more in control, which will help us feel better. Trying anything is going to make a difference in shifting that. Feeling more in control helps us to feel better. It helps us to think more clearly. It reduces all those neurochemicals going on in your brain. Thinking more clearly will help you problem solve, find more ways to behave in healthier ways. So stay connected with others. Stay connected with yourself in old ways that have worked and in new ways you haven't tried yet. Remember, we are not alone. We are part of a community, a global community that is also struggling with the same fears that we are. There are many resources out there, people coming up with creative things every day. And human beings are resourceful and have resilience. We can find it within ourselves. We can share it with others. We can receive it from others. Take good care of yourselves. Thanks for listening. I hope you found something you can try that will be of help. I'm Mary Thompson.